Hello, colleagues, and welcome again to our next episode of DINCast, where I'm delighted to be joined by Kursty, author, workplace strategy advisor, and founder of consultancy Shape Work Life. And you can probably guess what we're going to be talking about today, which is about the future of the workplace. So, Kursty, welcome along this morning.
Lovely to be here. Thanks, Ian.
So obviously you're well known, as I say, as a thought leader in this space. You've had a couple of uh, books published around space for innovation, and what I particularly like, wish I worked there. This must be a really interesting time for you, thinking about what the future of the workplace looks like. So do you want to sort of just tell our viewers sort of a little bit about yourself and I suppose your journey as to, why you've ended up looking at this particular issue?
Yeah, sure, of course. I think the first thing I want to say is yes, it's been a very interesting time with things changing overnight, and then lots of other things to be thinking about. So, my journey actually originally started as an industrial designer. So I read engineering and then design. At university and then postgraduate, and I very quickly moved into the world of innovation. So I was all about how to create new products, services, experiences for people. And along the way, I became incredibly interested in the process of innovation, the process of creativity, and how to unlock that in people. Because I fundamentally believe that as human beings, we're all creative, but it's just that we don't have the skills or the impetus to do it. So that's kind of my background. I worked in the innovation space for 20 plus years, and along the way I found that there was something around the physical environment that was being kind of overlooked when it came to creativity. And what intuitively, I think we all know that the place that we are in has an impact on how we feel, how we interact with other people. You just think about, a rundown ghetto versus a very large kind of pompous cathedral. I mean, you behave in a different way and you feel differently when you're in these different places and spaces. So I just thought, well, why aren't we applying that to work? And especially when it comes to creativity, we're expecting more and more for organizations to innovate, and creativity is the kind of the lifeblood of that. You have to employ a bit of creative problem solving and thinking in order to innovate. So why are we placing people in those environments that are kind of causing people to not express their thoughts, to feel like they have to toe the line, and that are just quite frankly uninspiring. So that was really what kind of switched me onto this whole space. Excuse the pun. And that was about I don't know, 12 or so years ago. At that point, I really didn't know that workplace consulting existed as an occupation. I was just interested in it, and that was why I went out and wrote the first book, because it was really me going and finding out which companies out there who I'd kind of heard through the grapevine were using their physical space as a strategic tool, effectively. Again, I didn't really have the language for it right back then. So companies, I mean, Google's the obvious one, but they were doing it way back then, when they were kind of looking at ways to connect people very quickly through their space. They were kind of telling the world that they were different, but of course some less obvious candidates as well that I went to see, and just understanding how those organizations were doing that. So that's kind of how I started, if you like.
It's a fascinating area, and I can fully understand why you've got into this particular sort of theme around that. But obviously, the times we're living in now must be really interesting for somebody with a sort of design thinker's brain like yourself, in terms of, wow, this is upended everything that you've been looking at. And I just wondered what your views were around how leaders are going to have to rethink and relook at the workplaces of the future.
Well, interestingly, I've been, along the way, I started by looking at space, but I was always looking at it holistically, as you say, with a design thinker's mind. So from the human experience, and it was always about how space enabled the right behaviors, the right culture, the right activities. And so I guess along the way, I've always been looking at what other ingredients that enable people to do their best work, whether that be individually or in teams, and how do they remain connected with the work that they need to do. And so really I've always played in the space, if you imagine a Venn diagram between people, organizations and space. So I kind of sit between that. So I have never always been purely about the physical space. I've always been about, those ingredients. So really what's happened now is much more of an acceleration towards the kind of things I was helping my clients to plan for anyway. But what we have seen are a whole load of, I guess, barriers dissolve in terms of digital technologies, people working from home and remotely, all of those things that were kind of barriers effectively, as I said, to people kind of having a more flexible, fluid, holistic approach to work. But we've also seen some barriers kind of been erected as well. So some of the challenges of working remotely and on your own, and staying connected are some of the huge kind of themes that we've seen emerging. So yeah, it's keeping me on my toes, absolutely. And I think it's a really, really interesting time. It's a challenging time, but it's also a time of opportunity, because we're all going through it. It's unprecedented in that nature, in the fact that it's so extreme, and it's happening across the board.
And in your sort of experience or your view of the future, in what circumstances do teams perform well in a physical environment that they can't do in a virtual environment?
Yeah, this is such an interesting question, an interesting place to explore. I think my simple answer to many things is there's no silver bullet. There's no one way of things working, and I think that applies here in terms of it depends on the team, and it depends on what the team's trying to achieve, and at which stage. So put that to one side. I think there are absolutely some things that happen so much better in the physical space when it comes to teams, and they are things like just tacit information being shared amongst people, those impromptu conversations, the looking over somebody's shoulder and just noticing something, the overhearing a conversation, the mentorship. There's all these little things that happen if you have a very well established, tight-knit team that has trust. They're the things they thrive incredibly well in a physical space. That said, if you have a really well established, tight-knit team with well established trust, with lots of trust, they also will do better remotely, by virtue of the fact that they have a very strong team and great communication. But those are the kinds of things that actually dial up the kind of the experience and the level of productivity of those teams in the physical sense. When it comes to those teams that aren't very well established, I think that's where being remote also does kind of pose some problems, because onboarding, again, mentoring, I think the big theme for me around the things that we've lost with if going fully remote or kind of an extended period of working remotely are the challenges of mentorship, of kind of impromptu collaboration and creativity. They're the three areas I think are really, and also kind of social cohesion, like real kind of cohesion and connection to the culture. They're the things that I think are challenged in the time that we have right now. And what I'm not saying is that they're impossible to build remotely, because we've seen some all remote, 100% remote companies out there. Zapier's one, 37 Signals is another. They tend to be digital based only, and they also tend to be built remote from the ground up. So it is possible, but I think those are the challenges that people are facing right now.
And are there particular types of businesses, particularly, as I say, because a lot of organizations are already established, that will adapt more easily to this sort of hybrid approach than others? And what do you think will allow that to happen?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's why there's no one size fits all. Absolutely. And I think What you have is you have industry specific, and then you also have culture specific. So I think you need to think around those, and the leadership styles come into fall under the culture banner. So industry wise, of course, there are organizations that have specific machinery, materials, equipment that really can only be provided by an on-site facility. You know, think R&D, think construction, think develop any other kind of building development, manufacturing. I mean, it's clear, or labs, for example, it's clear that where you have those kind of specialist facilities, you need to have people on site. But when it comes to knowledge work, that is, business services, administration, law, even digital companies as well, where developing software, for example. All of those types of industries tend to be able to work remotely more easily. It stands to reason. But then if you layer on top of that the culture of the organization and the values, I guess the values, priority, and hierarchy. If you have an organization that is led by a very strong forward leader, and that has a culture of a more hierarchical culture, if you like, whereby people are kind of, they're less autonomous, then it's much more difficult for them to shift to a remote working situation where autonomy is absolutely paramount. As I'm sure you've experienced yourself, really having to be very strict with your timings in the day, and being very self motivated. It's a very, very different style of working.
So, I mean, a lot of leaders will have invested in their real estate and their office environments. Some of them literally sort of, months and weeks before sort of COVID hit.
Yeah.
How hard, what would your sort of advice be for those leaders who are having to look at their sort of physical real estate, yet balance it with the demands of the new way of working, because that's what their employees will actually want? Because that's going to be a tough decision.
It's a really, really big one, and it's happening, with most of my clients. So the clients that I'm working with at the moment are either in the camp of where we've committed to moving into a new building and a new environment, and that's going ahead, but how do we rethink and reshape what that might be for the future? And others are in the other camp, which is, oh gosh, we were just about to invest, now we're not sure if we should, or if we do, how much. But for those who are committed, I think regardless, for both, for anyone who's in either of those camps, I think my first piece of advice is to stand back and look at the longer term vision. Really spend a bit of time doing that. Don't just knee jerk, because I think the temptation is to say, oh my God, we've just spent X amount of money, securing this space. It's ready to go. Get everyone in there. Forgetting that there may be a huge fallout in terms of productivity, and actually, loss of trust, if you're actually pushing people into moving into somewhere that they're not comfortable. Also, second spike happens, you're going to have to shut it down again. So think about the costs of that. So I think what I'm not saying is don't go in, but what I am saying is make sure you really plan it through. And if you do plan a return to office, you can do it in a COVID secure way, and in a way that keeps people feeling like they're being really listened to, and they're really that their well-being is actually being taken care of. Because I've seen a couple of articles over the last few days, talking about kind of really just anticipating whether the government might be forcing people back into the office, because of course, there's a big challenge about the kind of boosting the economy and getting local food chains up and running again. But I think I don't think the government are going to be forcing anybody to do anything. However, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure, obviously, as you say, from organisations to get things back up and running. if you've invested in a place, it's still going to be there in 6 months' time, but you have time to really think about how it's going to work really well in a blended capacity. Because I think what you're going to find is it's actually going to be much more effective and efficient, and appealing as an employer to be able to provide a blended work from office, work from home scenario. It also gives you much more capacity as well, if you've invested in a space. And I think the final thing I would say, which is part of the planning, is have a look and see if there's any part of that space that you could actually sublease. So I'm seeing a lot of that happening as well, where there are options to kind of to either during the COVID secure phase spread out a little bit more, so people are feeling very, very safe and they're physically distanced appropriately, and then also once you transition into kind of more new normal, it may well be that you've got the option then to sublease.
And sort of final thing really, in terms of, if there was one organization or one company, and you've mentioned, a few like Zapier and what have you, that you think actually this is someone I would go and have a look at, or this is an organization I have a lot of time for and think that, for the future, this they've got a good model here. Who would you sort of go and recommend to go and have a look at?
So I'm not saying this because I'm biased, because they're a company I've worked with for a couple of years now, but they are a company I've worked with for a couple of years now because they're fantastic, and they're called MVF, M for Mother, V for Victory, F for Freddy. I can't remember the real way of doing it, and they are a digital, I think, marketing kind of sales generation company. So they're kind of digitally based, so they are able to work more remotely at the moment. But the way that they've approached it is by really considering, from the business and the culture perspective, how to do it their way. So they've looked at the government guidance, and then they've created their own response that follows and respects the government guidance, but that has their own spin on how they're going to react to that. They've communicated relentlessly with their employees. They've listened, and they've asked hard questions that they didn't know the answers to. So the way that they've actually treated the whole lockdown pandemic, and now planning their return to office, is really, really noteworthy. And don't get me wrong, they're not just it's not just easy for them, if you like. I mean, they have investors that they need to satisfy. They have to kind of make, that they're affected as everybody else is by the pandemic. They needed to furlough some people, so they've been through the mill as well. But just the way that they're handling it. And they're also looking at the moment, they're looking at a potential interim space so they can get some people back into the office, before they move the majority of their people in January in a COVID secure way into a new space. I mentioned that, these are one of the companies that are actually moving to a new space.
And final point for me, I mean, part of the reason for us having this sort of conversation, not least of which I loved your work around sort of, the innovation spaces and the creativity around that, is that we're looking between sort of DIN and yourself to sort of, undertake a discovery learning project, looking at what the future of the workplace might look like, and working with leaders to help them, as you say, ask those difficult questions and to work this through, because there are no, guides to help you sort of do this. And I just wondered, could you sort of just share with us the kind of things that we might look at and explore, and how such a discovery learning project may work?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So there's kind of, I would say there's kind of four main parts to it that I would say would kind of sprint through, if you like. And the first is the really practical, what do we do? It's how do we react to not just the immediate how do we react and respond, if you like, to the immediate situation in terms of the COVID threat level, but what happens if there's a second wave, what happens if there's not, so real kind of practical planning around that to land that. Then I think the next piece would be to really reflect around some of the learnings, and this gets into a little bit more culturally, what are the things that we found really challenging, and also technically, what are the things that we found surprising that we might use. So effectively, it's the reflect stage. I would call that kind of portion, I would call that a bit more kind of understanding understanding some opportunities. And then I would be going into reimagine phase, and that would, I think what would be great to do is use lots of examples from other organizations near and far to see how they've managed through some of those challenges or opportunities that we've uncovered, and really set out a vision of how we'd like it to be. And then finally, I think it would be for want of a better word, reshaping. So it might be saying that, our plan was to do X, but actually we think if we do Y, we're going to not only be able to get people back into the office in the short term safely, but also we start to pave a way towards a longer term way of working, which may or may not include different scenarios that we've been used to. So that might be working from home, it might be working in a third space, it might be whatever that might be.
Well, that sounds really exciting, Kirsty, and I really hope we can work on that and find some really innovative ways of designing the workplace of the future. So thank you very much for your time today. Really enjoyed that, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian.